Hello, friends. Lee Seacamp here. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Dr. Peter Levine. Peter's a psychotherapist, author, well renowned for his work in somatic experiencing, the creator of the field. It's a therapy focused on connecting with and experiencing emotions in the body. As best as I can tell, you might think about it this way, that traditional therapy, talk therapy, begins kind of in the head, in the ways that we are thinking, what we are thinking about, and the conversations that we have in our head. Somatic experiencing asks us to begin with our body and what we're experiencing in our body, with the belief that certain emotional experiences or traumas can be experienced in our body, and that may be really the only way that we might get back to recovering some of those and healing some of those. It's a remarkable, fascinating conversation. I'll admit that some of the approach I brought a certain skepticism to, but I found the conversation really fascinating and really remarkable. And so, like we saw in all of our interviews, right, and as I learned from friends in recovery, that old line about take what you can use and leave the rest. So I think that you'll find this quite fascinating if you're interested in healing from trauma and the gifts that therapy give to us. Also, a content warning that Peter's story involves sexual assault, and the interview also touches on the genocide of Jews by the Nazis and the Holocaust. So listener discretion is advised. Here's Dr. Peter Levine. Dr. Peter Levine is a renowned developer of somatic experiencing. He holds a medical and biological physics doctorate from the University of California at Berkeley and a doctorate in psychology from International University. He is a recipient of 4 Lifetime Achievement Awards and is the author of several books, including Waking the Tiger, which has now been printed in 33 countries and has sold over 1 million copies. His memoir, An Autobiography of Trauma, is his latest book, and we're grateful to have you joining us today, Dr. Levine. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks. Looking forward.
Yeah, grateful to have you with us. I wonder, for those who are unfamiliar with somatic experiencing, if we could kind of take several minutes just to begin to kind of give us an introduction to the field and the way this approach that you've developed.
Yeah. Let me give you kind of like an example that might be helpful for some people. You're driving in your car, and all of a sudden you see somebody coming right towards you, and you take a gasp. And if something like that happens over and over again, we stay in that gasp position. So it's something that's going on in the body. And in order to clear it, you have to be able to find a new experience in the body that contradicts that feeling of overwhelm or helplessness and so forth. So these are things that happen in the body. And so you have to go to the body to be able to free yourself, because the brain doesn't realize that this is not just something that's happened and it's over. It keeps replaying it and replaying it and replaying it. And in somatic experience, and we work with what happens in the body and then how to get unstuck where it's gotten stuck. So I'll give you another example, which might be a little bit more revealing. So it's a nice day, and you walk outside your house, and you see somebody has fallen off a bicycle, and it looks like they could be badly hurt. And so our brains recognize injury, and they send the message down to the body, and then the guts twist. Actually, Darwin talked about this nerve, which we now know as the vagus nerve, as being responsible for gut wrench and heartbreak. So again, something like that happens in our body, and then maybe we look more carefully and we see the person is really even more severely injured. And we just go, and it's like all the life is taken out of us. And maybe that night we're laying in bed and we feel we can't sleep. Our guts are still feeling twisted. And at the same time, we have an image that pops into our mind, a type of a flashback of the injury that we saw earlier that day. So again, it involves not just body sensations, but images and also beliefs that we have about certain situations. So while somatic experiencing is a bottom-up process, working with body sensations, body feelings. We also engage top-down processes, which is what's more common in like talk therapies and so forth.
Yeah, so that was the one thing I was going to begin to ask there then. So with talk therapy, the presumption is you begin with the mental cognition or the stories that we're telling in our brain about some given experience, and that may or may not ever kind of engage bodily experience, whereas you're saying begin with bodily experience and then see what that leads us into.
Well, we have to begin wherever the person is. So, but in order to really move through the trauma, to transform the trauma and to heal from the trauma, then that we have to do in the body.
I would imagine that the I have been in plenty of therapy sessions through the years, but I've not ever worked with a practitioner of somatic experiencing. Mm-hmm. But it sounds to me from what I've read that your approach perhaps takes a more I don't know. It seems to be a sort of more gentle, easy approach in the sense that you're asking someone to pay attention to what's in their body, which I think could be disarming. I don't know. Does that seem to be an accurate description?
We have to start slowly with that. And, for example, sometimes I might be working with a person who's very much in their head. They're really disconnected from their body at all, and which is not uncommon. And so I would be talking to them in their world, and then all of a sudden I might notice something change, something in their body. So somatic experiencing, we do a lot of tracking of the person's experience. And so I might then say, it's interesting, when you were talking about playing with your dog this morning, it seems like your face lit up. I'm just wondering if you were noticing anything about that.
Huh.
And then the person is more interested to reflect. In the book that you just mentioned, the book that I just finished, the Autobiography of Trauma, I had a childhood. There was a lot of violence, a lot of life threat, and there's an archetype, a Greek archetype called Chiron. And Chiron translates as the wounded healer. And most, if not all, therapists come also from their own wounds. And so we really need to address our own healing before we can really be with other people in that deep, meaningful, impactful way. And so one time I was experiencing very disturbing bodily sensations. And then also some momentary flashes of images, which I couldn't really grasp onto. And so I realized it was time for me to take a dose of my own medicine. So I asked one of my students to sit with me and to be my guide. And in somatic experiencing, we very rarely go right to the trauma. We go, as I mentioned, to an experience that contradicts that of overwhelming helplessness. And so what came up as my guide was guiding me is something that happened when I was, I think it was my 4th birthday, 4 years old. And in the middle of the night or early in the morning, my parents must have snuck into my bedroom and laid underneath the tracks and then back into the room and then back again underneath the bed. I'm sorry. And when I awoke, I woke to the train going around under my bed, out into the room. And to say I was exuberant would be an understatement. I literally jumped out of bed and ran over to the transformer so I could control the speed and make the horn go toot toot. And although I didn't have the words for it at the time, that told me that I was cared for, that I was loved. And then feeling that in my body, then that allowed me to take the next step, which was to deal with a violent episode where I was I was raped, molested by a gang because my father he wasn't involved with the mafia, but the chief mafia person uh, uh, tried to make him to testify against him. It's a long story. It wasn't that he was doing anything wrong, but he found himself in this situation. And so basically he told my father, my family, my mother, my father, that if my father testified against him, that they would find his family face down in the East River. That was us. So that was a lot of violence. But being able to shift back and forth, to pendulate, to shuttle back and forth between this experience of being cared for, of being loved, and of being devastated. I was able to do that. And in doing that, I was really able to put that in the past where it belonged and be able to go on in my life. So again, this is a key. It's not just working with trauma, but it's really working with the sense of being cared for, of being, having somebody that cared for us, that loved us.
Yeah. You have a line in that book, your most recent book, where you say research is me search,
Yes.
which I find very helpful. And even for me, and doing lots of years of academic work, as I would begin to try to think through, why did I do all of the work that I did in some given field? And then trying to integrate that and realize that part of my healing and integration of myself relates to me making sense of why I made all of those decisions. I found that to be a very helpful insight. Yeah. And at one point, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, we're all in some way or another trying to make sense of our lives. And actually, when I started writing the book, the autobiography, I didn't plan to do it as a book at all. It was just a way of kind of, because I'm at the age now, I'm in my mid 80s. And so even though I'm a pretty vibrant, healthy person, I clearly have less years in the future than from the moment of conception to where I am right now. And so I realized it was time to really write my own story. And that's really what originally, it wasn't to be a book. It was just to find that trajectory in my life. And what's her name? Allende.
Yes, Isabel Allende.
Isabel Allende. She quoted, I think it was a Jewish proverb that said something like, "What is truer than truth? Answer the story." And I really believe that we all have our own stories to tell. And that was one of the reasons for writing the book, to encourage people to tell their own stories. And again, I had no plans to make this in a book. I had a very good friend, and she said, when are you going to publish it as a book? And I said, no way. It's too vulnerable. It's too raw. It's too revealing. People would really know some of my deepest secrets. And she said, well, I really think that this could help people, help other people. And she encouraged me to just think about it.
Yeah.
And I did. I thought about it. And I didn't get anywhere with thinking about it top down. But sometimes, well, not sometimes, but a number of times in my life, not infrequently, when I feel stuck and I don't really know what my next step might be, I have a dream, and the dream can be important, can be revealing. So during this time, I had the following dream. I'm standing in front of a large field, a large meadow, and I am holding in my hands a whole bunch of papers, like some kind of a manuscript. And I look to the left, and I look to the right, and I look again to the left and to the right. And again, I wouldn't say I'm frozen, but I'm stuck. I don't know where to go. And in that moment, this breeze comes from behind me and takes all of these pages into the air,
Huh.
out into that meadow to land where they might land. And that is really where it began to be the story. I knew my dream, my unconscious had made the decision. I just didn't know it yet.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's lovely. There's another passage you quote Rainer Maria Rilke.
Oh, yeah.
Is that how you pronounce last name, Rilke?
Yeah, yeah.
You quote Rainer Maria Rilke, who writes, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves. Do not now seek the answers which cannot be given you, because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer."
Yeah.
And then you say, "I did just that for the next 40 plus years."
That's right.
Unpack some of that for us. It's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, these were the questions about my life. And as I was saying, I didn't come to answers. I really didn't. I would work with different aspects. I mean, one of the things also that I acknowledge are some of the people in my life who have been very important mentors to me. There's one chapter that says the most important women in my life, and everybody thinks that these are romantic relationships, but it's not. These people who were teachers, some of them were alive and some not. And Rilke was one of those teachers, although I never knew him personally, but of course I knew that quote. And, these are the questions that I kept asking. Oh, I committed myself in writing the book to tell the truth wherever it would take me. So maybe substitute truth for questions, because I didn't know where they would go. But I knew that I had to tell that, to be honest with myself and to be honest with the readers. So again, Rilke, I mean, I had teachers who were very, very surprising, you might say. Probably one of the most surprising, maybe I'll just say a little bit about it, was my encounter with Albert Einstein. Talk about questions. Let me go on. So I was at Berkeley. This was in the early 1970s. And I was developing the somatic experiencing at the time, but also doing my doctoral work in the medical and biophysics department. And also teaching a class to undergraduates to kind of help pay for my room and board. And I had a favorite restaurant. It's called the Beggar's Banquet. I actually did a book reading a few months ago. And there was somebody right in the front. First of all, lovely that it was an actual bookstore. And there was somebody in the front who actually also went to that restaurant about the same time. So we had this wonderful connection. Anyhow, this chapter is called Albert and Me at the Beggar's Banquet. So I would come there, and they were very warm people, kind people, and they would always welcome me and usually seat me in my particular table with two chairs. And I would start usually with some bowl of warm soup with French bread, like crunchy on the outside and moist and soft on the inside. And the troubles from that day would just kind of recede. And I kind of like, the feeling from the soup gave me that feeling in my belly of warmth. So one evening when I was sitting there, I saw a figure come from the left side and motion me to, if he could sit down. I realized that this was an image of Albert Einstein. And I mean, remember, at that time, I'm a scientist. I'm doing doctoral work. And I know that this man who was wild hair and a crumpled jacket that was 2 or 3 size is too big for him. But I recognized him as Albert Einstein. And so began a year of conversations between Albert and me. Now, again, as a scientist, I know, first of all, Albert Einstein wasn't alive at the time. Second of all, that this was not something that I knew wasn't real, but in a way it was real. And Jung talks about, Carl Jung, about active imagination. And this is a kind of a way to bridge conscious and unconscious experiences. And so, you know, I knew that, but at the same time, these encounters seemed so real. And I would ask him questions. Now, getting back to questions, I would ask him questions, and he would ask me questions about my questions. In the way that Socrates taught his students, the Socratic method of inquiring. And we would do this, many, many, many times, encounters. And at the end, the last encounter that we had, after about a year, was I was noticing that people's traumas were not just things that was happening to them in their lifetime, but was also things that might have happened to their parents, their grandparents, their great-great-grandparents, and their ancestors. And so I asked him about that. And like in a dream within a dream, or with a dream within an active imagination, he motioned me to come to a pond, and he had a yardstick, a meter stick, with a number of small stones along the length of the yardstick. And he put them over the pond and then twisted in all of the stones came to the water at the same time, and it would make ripples out in all directions, not just forward, but backwards and sideways as well. And then he showed me what happens when the two of these wave fronts get stuck. Everything after that gets distorted in the past, in the present. And I asked him, I said, well, can you tell me how to help people who have had these generational traumas? And he said, and when I talk about this, I mean, it does bring tears. He said, Peter, I don't have the answer for that, but you do, and you will. And around that time, I started really developing ways of working with these ancestral, not just traumas, but sometimes very powerful, beautiful transmissions from ancestors. And when we would change something in our own bodily experience, then it would change in our ancestors. Because again, remember, these waves are going out in every direction, forward, sideways, backward. And this man who I was talking to knew something about space-time waves.
That is fascinating. So this whole notion of generational trauma I find fascinating. And there's there's one part of me that seems to hear that as intuitively makes a lot of sense, and then there's another kind of rational, irrational, I don't know which it is, part of me that's quite distrustful and saying, I don't know. I guess we're so schooled in notions of individualism, we don't want things like that to be true.
That's right.
But you discussed some research that was done at at Emory University Medical School with mice and cherry blossoms that just kind of blew my mind. Would you just describe that?
And mine too. We share that our mind was blown by this research. Okay. Let me finish the story of Einstein.
Yes, please.
Then I'll go back to that. About 35 years ago, I was visiting my parents in New York, and I was downtown going to museums. And at the end of the day, I came back, took the D train, went up the hill, opened the door to my parents' apartment, and they were sitting together on a couch. And but I noticed there was a bookshelf above them, and there was one book that stood out, and it was Einstein's Theory of Relativity. So when I saw the book, my mother, we definitely had a difficult relationship, but she could be quite intuitive. And I told her of what had happened to me, of my encounters with Einstein, my imaginary encounters with Einstein. And she said, they weren't imaginary, Peter. They really happened. And I went, what? I wasn't sure that I was even hearing her. And she said, when I was pregnant with you, 8 months pregnant, your father and I were canoeing on this lake in New Jersey, and a wind squall came and tipped the canoe over. And they tried to right the canoe to get back in, and they couldn't do it. So they certainly would have perished. And of course, I wouldn't be talking with you now because I wouldn't be here. And in that time of life threat, a small sailboat came by with a young woman and an old man, and they pulled my parents to safety and gave them, towels to dry off. And they introduced themselves to my parents as Albert Einstein and his stepdaughter. So somehow my mother realized, I mean,
it's so fascinating.
One of the people who, I had requested for an endorsement for the book, they said, only if you take that part out, because it's too fanciful. Nothing like that could happen. But it did. But it did. And again, one of the gifts I appreciate from my parents, my mother especially, was her capacity to be intuitive. And that's something that I've also brought forth in my life. So, okay, so what was your question again?
I was asking about generational trauma.
Oh, yeah.
And the research done at Emory.
Yes. Okay, the way I first discovered this, and that's when I brought it to Einstein's attention, and this was in the early 70s. So I was working with a number of people, and there were some people that experienced the smell of burning flesh. And and some of them were vegetarians. So it didn't make logical sense. So anyhow, I asked them, because again, I was kind of going along with this idea of generational effects, what they knew about their parents and their grandparents and even their great-great-parents' lives. And a few of them had ancestors that were in the Holocaust. I mean, that's pretty horrifying. And the fact that they were actually being able to have these smells, I made sure not to talk about it, because I reasoned that if I did, people would think I was crazy. So, and again, how can a smell get passed on from generation to generation? So then some years ago, I came across this very interesting research. They were in the experiment. They had a group of mice now and they exposed them to the scent of cherry blossoms. Now, for humans, that's a pleasant smell, a pleasant aroma. It certainly wasn't aversive to mice, because they would, just smell it, and then they would go back to whatever they were doing. But then what we would do is then pair the scent of the cherry blossom with an electric shock to the foot, and the animals would freeze and tremble and defecate and shake to the scent of the cherry blossom. So that's not a surprise. That's a basic Pavlovian conditioned reflex. Conditioned stimulus, unconditioned stimulus. And okay, that could have been the end of the experiment. But they took it a step further. They bred these mice for, I think, 5 or 6 generations. And then at the 6th generation, they they exposed the great-great-great-grandchildren to the scent, the innocuous scent of cherry blossom. And they shook and trembled and defecate, in many cases, more strongly than had their great-great-great-grandparents done.
Mm.
And this was actually more in the male genome that was passed from male on. So if the males were conditioned, then it was more likely that these generations later will have that same reaction. And it confirmed that from my experience, actually, because with my father, his parents were Holocaust survivors. And it really led me to do some more of my own healing around those issues. And again, using that image of Einstein, of finding the places where these wave fronts got stuck and finding a way to move through and back into coherence and back into flow.
I think the closest I've had in some of my own experience with kind of what I hear you describing is some years ago, I did a number of sessions of EMDR therapy. And the therapist explained, if I understood her correctly, that there's some vagueness and lack of clarity exactly about how that works, but that one theory is that there's this, or hypothesis is that we get stuck in a certain way of dealing with some sort of difficulty. We're kind of stuck in an earlier state of emotional reaction. And by going through EMDR, we can kind of see a new way of looking at it with adult eyes, with the help of somebody else, and then have some sort of new way to respond to that.
Yep.
But it is just, I think until that point, I hadn't really considered that, things that have happened so long ago were still so present to me.
That's right.
And
the past is not dead. It's not even in the past. William Faulkner.
Yes. Yeah. That it's always with us.
It's always with us.
And that so much then of the life of the work of our life is to try to find some sort of way to integrate that. And
That's right.
I appreciated the ways that you point us toward that the work seems not to be somehow to shunt that off and to then ignore it, but somehow to bring it in some sort of way of, you're not denying the pain or the trauma, but somehow bring that into one's own integrated self. So you maybe unpack some of that for us?
Well, all the work in somatic experiencing is done in the here and now. So we may reflect backwards, but also we may reflect forwards. And the word you use, stuck, is really the key, because we do get stuck, and we get stuck in the nervous system. We get stuck in the body. So the idea in the here and now is to find out where we got stuck and how we can move forward from that stuck place. And again, that's what, in my experience, has to happen in the body. We believe that we're the captains of our own ships. And like you talked about some therapy you did, we learn that that's somewhat of an illusion, and that people who have done therapy or done self-reflection realize that there are things in their lives that have influenced them. So what I'm saying is start with that and then shuttle back to things that might have happened in the past to our different ancestors. So to find out where we're stuck, and again, that's something that's in the body. This is really the way we started our discussion. See where it's stuck, and then to be able to move through that stuckness. I can give an example if maybe people want to participate in this.
Please.
But please don't feel that necessary to participate. The example I gave of, going out from your door and seeing somebody injured and our guts twisting. Well, when that gets stuck, we continue to replay that trauma as though it's happening in the present, even though it's something that happened in the past. So anyhow, if this becomes more of a chronic feature. We have upset stomachs, we have irritable bowel syndrome kind of things. And so the question is how to help people get out of this stuck place in their guts back into the here and now. And so I played around with many, many different possibilities, particularly with breath and with sounds. So for example, if I ask you to just take an easy, deep breath, and on the exhalation to make the sound woo that's coming from the belly, you're now getting a new stimulus, again, this vagus nerve, the neurogastric nerve of Darwin, that going from brain and body, two-way, but there's even a stronger effect from the body to the brain than from the brain to the body. And so in this exercise, if people want to join us, I take an easy full breath, and on the exhalation, I make the sound and vibrate the sound as though it's coming from my belly. No, as coming from my belly. So I make the sound and the breath go, ooh, and I let the breath and the sound go all the way, ow, and again, join me if you wish. Then wait for the breath to come in, filling belly and chest. Ooh. Then tell me, what are you noticing right now?
Certainly the release of some of my anxiety. And
release of anxiety.
Yeah. And being present to the moment.
More present. These are typical. Yeah. Sometimes people will say they feel warmth in their belly, or warmth radiating through their body, or tingling or vibration. Most of them are positive experiences, but sometimes it might bring up something that was related to a traumatic experience. And then we would work with that. But again, the key here is to switch out of that stuck in the gut, be able to come back into the here and now. So again, that's just one of many, many different, I don't call them techniques, but tools that we utilize in somatic experiencing work.
You quote Professor Julian Flarin saying, quote, "The creative adult is the child that has survived," end quote. And you have this kind of beautiful thread of curiosity and creativity that runs throughout your memoir, and that perhaps the recovery of that as you kind of do all this work on yourself and kind of work through your own traumas, but unpack some of that for us.
Yeah. In the last chapter of the book, the chapter is called Living My Dying. And again, that's kind of taking my steps, my halting steps to my own mortality. And in doing that, what came up was an image of myself as an 18-month-old child. And this was before some of this horrendous trauma occurred. And in connecting to that child, that was in a way taking me by my hand, taking him by his hand, taking me by his hand, and he by my hand, and going into those final days of my life. And if it's okay, I want to just show you that picture.
Please. I love that picture.
Yeah, me too. I actually keep that picture in my living room in my house to really remind me of that vitality, of that liveness. And again, we all have that, not just an inner child, but a magical child that lives in us. And I could say that all roads lead to Rome and to creativity and to the creative impulse in all of us and all of our lives. So yeah, that's a great quote. It really is. It really is. And again, one of the things about active imagination, when I did a little research on that, it said that this is something that children exhibit, but no adults do. And I thought, that is totally crazy. As adults, we need that more even than a child. We absolutely need it.
Yeah,
But it is something, a child, when they play, you see this imagination, you see their creativity. I actually did not have any children of my own, but I have several godchildren. And I have many memories of playing with them and being astonished by their creativity and grateful that they were sharing that with me.
Yeah. You said earlier that when a friend asked you about when you were going to publish your recollections as a book, you said, no, there's no way. It's too vulnerable and shares too many of my secrets. I was, as you shared that just now a moment ago, I thought, I can see me saying the same if I were to try to write a book like this, and that you're so vulnerable about the traumas you experienced, and you're so vulnerable about even the way in which those traumas then led you to have to do a lot of work in making sense of integrating your own sexuality and your own sexual experiences through your life.
That's right.
But any further commentary on that, or anything you want to say about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is very vulnerable. And what my friend said, and which I took to heart, and that's, I think, why the dream came up. She said, Peter, I think if you write this book, you'll be helping other people write their own stories. They may not choose to publish them, but they can, again, write the stories, look at the trajectory of their lives, be able to form a more coherent narrative. And I think I took that to heart, her advisement. And and it was difficult. Yeah. It was really, really, really difficult. The first time I spoke about this in public, there's a conference called the Evolution of Psychotherapy, and they usually have, like 4,000 to 8,000 people attending. And so I was standing in front of this audience, and the title of my talk was An Autobiography of Trauma. And my throat constricted and caught. And the words wouldn't come out. But then I remembered I actually had lunch earlier that day with a couple of my colleagues who were also presenting at this conference, and how much they supported me in writing their comments about the book. And so I could feel them by my side and behind me, having my back. And then the words just came. So again, that support, even as adults, we really need it from others and from other people who care about us and who we care about them. So I think, and by the way, the person I was having lunch with was a good friend of mine. I don't know if you've interviewed him, but he's a good person to talk about. His work is Gabor Mate. But anyhow, it was just, again, feeling the presence of those people who supported me, who said, even non-verbally, Peter, go for it, do it. You can be scared, but still do it. Go and go with it. And I think again, having those people in my life has made a world of difference. A world of difference.
Yeah, that encouragement you heard from them of be scared, but keep going, right? Keep leaning in. I think the notion of courage that's needed for all of us to face our own stuff is just crucial.
Yeah.
And that made me flash back to this, one of these seasons of therapy. I remember I was one of the folks who you alluded to earlier, in their head, completely unaware of their emotions and feelings and their body. And as a matter of fact, in one of the early sessions, he said to me, "What are you feeling?" And I said, "I don't know."
What?
And he smiled and he said, "I think you're telling the truth."
Oh, that's cute. I like that.
But one of the things that he said, I think in the very first session, was he said, he said, this may be one of the hardest things you've ever done. And when he said that, I kind of dismissed it. I thought, oh, that's just kind of psychotherapist babble, you know. But then, in time, I realized, no, it really was. It was one of the hardest things that I've ever done. And so, what kind of encouragement would you give? Encouragement to courage would you give to people who are listening, and they suspect there might be some way in which they are stuck that they might want to begin to face?
Let me give you another exercise that your audience can do if they want. So again, if starting with somebody who doesn't have any sense of their body, again, your therapist is exactly the right thing to you. So I'll say, okay, so just look at your hand. Are they more open or are they more closed? So if they're more open, look at them if they open more. And then look at them as they close and close more. And then look at them again as they open. Now, not just looking at them, but actually putting your mind in your hands, feeling the sensations in your hands, and then just notice what happens when you slowly contract your hands into a fist, and then slowly, gradually opening your hands and opening your hands. And when your hands are open, again, just sense them, feel them as much as you can, tension, position, vibration, anything. And then just letting them close again into a fist. And as you have feeling them in your fist, maybe notice if there's some sense of strength or power or even anger in your fist. And whatever it is, just sense it physically. And then when you've done that, then again, just slowly, slowly open your hands, feeling the sensation of the hands becoming open. And maybe the sense of reaching for something with the open hands, maybe reaching for something. And maybe it's something you really want for yourself. If it is, then taking that and then bringing it here into your chest and into your heart. And I don't think I've ever worked with somebody, no matter how disconnected they are with their sensations and feelings, that doing this will at least evoke the beginning of that and take a place. Because once people get that sense, they really go with it. You know, I gave a lecture once, and I was talking to a group, and there was a young man there who was on the spectrum. And so he wanted to do some sessions with me. He didn't live in the same area. He was living in Northern California. So he would fly down, and I would do three or four sessions with him. And he would come in with his computer, and he would type in questions to ask me. And then I would get the email on my computer. He had me open my computer, and I would answer him. And that's where we started. And we went that way for a couple of years. And then we did something a little bit like I showed with the hands. And then all of us, the third time he came down, he didn't open his computer. And we sat and we talked a little bit. The following year, he came in and he had met a lovely young woman, and they had started dating. They got married, and every January, I receive a wonderful postcard of their young first baby and then a young child. And that child is just full of life. So we started where he was. And I think that's the key. If you try to get the person out of their head and into their body, it ain't going to wash. We have to, again, meet the person where they were and then gradually introduce them one way or another into the bodily experience, the bodily felt sense, a term that was coined by a friend, Eugene Gendlin.
In just the last few moments we have here, a couple of finishing questions. One, what would you say? We've talked about the need for courage to step into these places where we might be stuck and to work on our stuff. And at the same time, I wonder sometimes, where's the line, you think, between a courageous examination of one's traumas, a courageous willingness to do work on oneself on the one hand, and a sort of indulgent self-introspection or navel gazing on the other side? What's the health there?
Yeah. Oh man. Wow. That's a beautiful question. We'll have to do another interview later. We all have our shadow sides. And so, definitely it took courage for me to do this excavation and to write this book. Mm-hmm. But in all honesty, I think there's some small amount of self-indulgence. But I think it's like maybe 2 to 4% compared to the courage, which was the great majority. But I think, and thank you for bringing me to task on that. I think it's something that I do need to acknowledge, that there was some element of that, but it was not the dominating force.
Yeah, I certainly don't raise the question as calling you to task, because I didn't detect it in there, but it as I have grown more aware myself, it always seems like so many times there's this fine line in so many of the things that we work on where it can kind of fall.
Feel your hands when you said there's a fine line. Just notice your hands.
Yes.
Just be curious.
Yes.
Okay, you can go on with the question.
I will think more about that. And for those listening and not watching, I had put my hands up in kind of a posture of I guess a palms together, kind of classic.
To me, it looks like grace. But that's just me.
Yeah. Yeah, and because certainly I certainly want some grace to navigate some of these lines I'm talking about. So, for example, as I learned years ago to start paying attention to my own emotions and my own emotional state, and the way in which I would not allow myself to feel deeply sad when I really should feel deeply sad about things I was processing, then I started realizing there was a tendency, the tendency that if I began to acknowledge my sadness, the place I could be tempted to go to or seem drawn to sometimes was to go over into self-pity, which didn't serve me well. Acknowledging my sadness served me well, but that became a space in which I could find myself falling prey to self-pity. So it seems like so many of these things, it's a sort of new way of learning to be, and then it brings with it its own sort of potential additional pitfalls or other things we could fall into. So commentary or thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, let me give you kind of an example. Sometimes when I'm working with somebody, especially somebody, who's very cut off from their feelings and their sensations, and I notice the beginning of a tear forming, instead of saying, well, what are you feeling in your body? I might say something. If you let your tears speak, if you let them speak, not you, not this part, but if you let your tears speak, what might your tears want to say? And usually that helps people get into a much deeper connection with their feelings and their sensations. Letting them speak, letting the tears speak.
Yeah. Yeah, that made me flash back to a moment in a session where my tears were flowing, and I immediately moved to wipe them away. And I was encouraged to let them just run down my face. And
yes, exactly.
Instead of trying to let them be put away so quickly.
Yeah.
As kind of a closing word, as you've done this work on this kind of vulnerable gift of sharing your own experience and your own way that has led you to do the work that you've done with your life. maybe one or two words of encouragement, or one or two words of possibility of things that from your own experience you would say, consider these things as you continue to look at yourself, as you continue to find your own way forward. That might be helpful place for us to end.
Yeah, I think self-examination is important. It's vitally important. To take it where it will take you, to know that we may have very smart conscious minds, but we have an unconscious mind, as Jung talked about, that's very much wiser than the conscious mind. And I would suggest to follow that mind and see where that mind takes you. For me, it was dreams and synchronicities. All of a sudden, I realized that I've met somebody and they part an important part of my life. And this, I could say, was just a coincidence, but it's rather a coincident. And I think these things happen to us all the time, but we're not listening to them. One last dream that I had is this man is driving in a 1948 Hudson convertible on the Hudson River underneath the George Washington Bridge. And he puts his fist into the air and says, God, if you exist, then give me a signal. And then he doesn't realize that the left turn signal is blinking, but he wasn't listening. And I think that's my challenge, is to really listen to those inner promptings and take them serious. I almost always by my bed have a pad and a pen, and I'll have a dream. And if I don't write the dream, it's going to be gone. And, the thing is, this is not quite accurate, but in order for the dreams to keep speaking to us, they need to know that we're serious about them. So if you don't write them down, they say, why bother talking to this guy or this conscious part of him? Because he's not really ready or not interested, and he's not living the questions. And I write them down. And if I fall back to sleep, at least I know I've written them down. And then I'll look at the dream. I'll examine the dream. I might, from here, talk about some of the questions I have from the dream, but also I'll look at different aspects of the dream and feel them, sense them in my body. And so synchronicity in dreams, I think, are, in a way, the royal route to individuation and to coming to selfhood. And I think, we have an instinct to heal, an instinct to come to wholeness. And again, I think that was what prompted me in writing the autobiography and in working on the book I'm working on right now, which is called Trauma and Spirituality, Resilience and the Human Spirit. It is about connecting to that spirit, that spiritual part of ourselves. And we all have different ways to do that. And so again, I just encourage you all to find your way to walk tall. This is the Navajo chant, to walk tall and walk in beauty. And thank you for the discussion today. It was lovely.
Been talking to Dr. Peter Levine, developer of Somatic Experiencing, about his most recent memoir, An Autobiography of Trauma. Peter, thanks so much. It's been a delight to talk to you.
Yeah,
and
indeed.
Grateful for your time. Thank you. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriette Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.